All right there. Now this is a new lens from Sony, and this feels like a little bit of a special one because this is the Mark II of one of my favorite G Master prime lenses. Look at that, that's the 85mm f1.4 G Master Mark II. And that makes a lot of sense because we've seen Mark II versions of some of the zoom lenses, right? 2470, 7200. It makes sense that we'd start seeing some of the prime lenses. And we've had the 50mm f1.2 G Master lens. We've had the 35mm f1.4 lens, which wasn't that long ago. So it makes sense that one of the oldest prime lenses would be updated, the 85mm f1.4, because the original 85mm f1.4 came out back in 2016, which means it's 8 years old. And while that's still a very lovely lens, and actually I love shooting on that 85mm f1.4, it's a beautiful lens to shoot on, capable of getting some really lovely images, especially things like portraits. Ooh, it does make sense that Sony would want to update it, especially since technology has moved on quite a lot since 2016, especially in the camera world, right? I mean, cameras now are able to do so much more than they were 8 years ago. And that is reflected in the glass that you put on the front. Now, Sony have sent this to me to review. I've literally just unpacked it. So we're gonna take this out and see exactly what it can do. We're gonna talk about what Sony are trying to achieve with this, the differences between this and the Mark I, and just actually how this stands up as a G Master lens in the lineup. Let's go and test that out. This lens for the last couple of days. I've been out and about shooting, I've been shooting indoors, trying it out in slightly different lighting conditions with different kinds of subjects as well. The classic sort of portraiture, which a lens like this is absolutely perfect for, but also some slightly faster moving subjects. That was one of the downsides of the original 85mm f1.4 G Master lens, the Mark I, was the autofocus was a little bit slow, right? Fair enough, that lens came out 8 years ago, but that was one of the things that Sony said they had massively improved with this lens, that it would work with cameras like the A9 III, 120 frames a second. I was shooting mostly with the A7R5, but I also had the A1. But I wanted to test that out with my dog running across the beach and really get a sense for how it could cope with keeping up with fast moving subjects, but also a bit of landscape, a few different things, right? 85mm can often feel like a portrait lens through and through, and absolutely, it is lovely for that. But you can actually do a lot with a lens like this. There's a lot of scope for the kinds of shots you can get. And that's absolutely true here. Now, I was a big fan of the Mark I lens. I actually love using that lens. So it's interesting to test this out because there's things that are very obviously different, right? Immediately, when you pick this up, you start using it, some things that are immediately noticeably and significantly different from the Mark I. But there are some other things which take a little bit longer to really notice. And actually some of it is getting the pictures back onto the computer, loading them up and looking at them a little bit bigger. You do start to notice a few differences, which are quite interesting. The biggest difference, of course, is the size and the weight of this, right? As was the case with the other Mark II lenses we've seen, it's a lot lighter and actually a little bit smaller as well. It's about the same height, but it's quite a bit less bulbous. And that means it just feels so much nicer in the hand. I really, really like the way this feels. And actually going back to the Mark I, it's so much, just bulbous is the word that keeps coming to mind. It's so sort of chunky by comparison. And the weight is really quite significant, right? This is about 20% lighter, it's about 640 grams. And you really feel the difference when you're shooting with this. It's not that the Mark I is uncomfortably heavy, but actually holding them both like this, it's wild. The difference really is super noticeable. And I wouldn't really want to go back, not after using this. This is exactly how I felt about lenses like the 2470 Mark II, which is actually what I'm shooting on now. The weight difference is just really nice. And actually that makes sense, right? Technology has moved on a lot in the last 8 years. Sony have obviously been able to get that great optical quality you'd expect from a G Master lens, but just make it a lot lighter and a bit smaller as well. Otherwise, actually the design of the lens is pretty similar to the Mark I. You've got the aperture ring on there, you've got the manual focus ring, although that has actually been slightly changed as well. The throw, right, so how much you have to turn it to actually move that focus point is a lot shorter, which means it's actually just a lot easier, right? You don't have to move your hand into awkward positions. You've got the click on and off for the aperture ring, focus hold button on the side, and an iris lock as well, which is always useful for locking in that aperture. But with a lens like this, it really is all about image quality. I mean, that's true of pretty much any lens. And I'm really happy to say, no big surprise to be honest, but it really lives up to that G Master quality that you would probably expect. Now, it's a premium lens, right? So it wants to be very high optical quality, and that's what you get with G Master lenses, is pretty much the best of the bunch. And this is where you do get some differences, right? That might seem a little bit subtle at first, but actually start to build up to make a bit of a difference, right? So it's 85mm f1.4, so it can feel very, very similar to shooting with the Mark 1. And certainly the Mark 1 was lovely and sharp, right? That's absolutely the case here. That's not particularly surprising. But what you start to notice when you're taking these images and you get back and you look at them on the bigger screen is you're getting some really lovely detail out towards the edges of the image, which perhaps with the Mark 1 wasn't always the case, right? It would be nice and sharp in the center, but start to fall off towards the edges. Whereas here, you are getting nice, clear sharpness right out to the edges of the frame. And that's also true with the rendering, right? So the actual contrast is really lovely on this lens, and it's noticeable that things don't tend to bleed into one another so much. You're getting that contrast, that difference between the different things in the frame, even if the actual contrast between them isn't as much as you might like with more defined lighting. And speaking of the rendering, the reason I wanted to use the A7R5 was to really test out the resolution. Now, I wasn't particularly expecting to run into any problems with a G Master lens on the A7R5, but that is the higher resolution camera that I had available, right? 61 megapixels. So I wanted to see how that would perform with this lens. Now, like I said, no big surprise. It's absolutely beautiful, but it is nice to see that little bump in contrast, sharpness out to the edges, and something else which is really quite subtle, but it makes a difference on a fast aperture lens like this. The bokeh itself is very smooth, and the transition between some of the autofocus elements is very, very nice. And it's just a subtle difference, but you'll notice that kind of the bokeh balls, right, are not quite as sharp, which is nice. They feather very nicely. You don't get a bit of an edge to it. They feather really beautifully. And that is different to the Mark 1. Now, that is one of those things that you're only going to notice if you're really starting to look, but over time, that is the kind of thing that makes a bit of a difference. And just overall, all these things, right? Better sharpness, the contrast, the rendering, the detail, being able to shoot with faster subjects, the AF being much faster, the lens feeling lighter in the hand, better in the hand. It builds this just much better experience of using this lens. As you'd expect with the new G Master lens, it's got two XD linear motors in, which is what Sony tends to put in their lenses now when they want nice, fast, precise, and very quiet autofocus. And that's exactly what you get with this lens. And like I say, that means it's able to keep up much better with subject tracking, which is obviously much improved from 8 years ago on the camera side. And it can even perform with cameras like the A9 III, shooting 120 frames a second. So you've got really good speed available to you then. It means it catches back up to where the technology is now, which is great. It is true that it's one of the more premium options for an 85 f1.4 on Sony E-mount, but there is good reason for that. And G Master lenses are difficult to beat, to be honest. So if you really do want pretty much the best of the best for E-mount when it comes to this focal length and a nice fast aperture, this just is the lens to go for. You're gonna be able to get some stunning portraiture and actually lots of other stuff as well. You can actually check out the full spec and all the fun stuff about this lens by following the link down in the description, including pricing and all that kind of fun stuff. I'll also link all the cameras we use for all these photos and things like that down there as well, so you can go check them all out for yourself, including the kit we use for these videos. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there's new content all the time. I will see you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.